Georgia, 1944. The afternoon sun beat down on Camp Gordon as Corporal James Mitchell of the 92nd Infantry Division stood outside a roadside diner, his uniform crisp despite the oppressive heat. Through the window, he watched German prisoners of war laugh over plates of fried chicken and sweet tea, served by smiling waitresses who refilled their glasses without hesitation. The same waitresses who had turned him away at the door 15 minutes earlier. The irony wasn't lost on Mitchell or the 3 other black soldiers standing beside him, men who had volunteered to fight for a country that wouldn't let them eat at its tables. What these soldiers didn't know was that this moment would spark a transformation that would ripple through the military, challenge the foundations of American segregation, and force the nation to confront a contradiction so glaring that even enemy soldiers would recognize its absurdity. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how the treatment of enemy prisoners exposed the deepest wounds of American democracy, and how black soldiers transformed humiliation into a catalyst for change that would reshape the military and contribute to the civil rights movement that followed. The scene at Camp Gordon wasn't unique. Across the American South, from Texas to Virginia, similar scenarios played out with disturbing regularity throughout 1943 and 1944. At Fort Benning in Georgia, Private First Class Robert Johnson watched enemy combatants board buses through the front entrance, while he and his fellow black soldiers were directed to the rear. At Camp Claiborne in Louisiana, Sergeant William Hayes stood in line at a post exchange, only to be told that German prisoners would be served first, as they were considered white. The system was methodical, bureaucratic, and crushing in its casual cruelty. Technical Sergeant Marcus Williams had joined the Army in 1942 with clear-eyed patriotism, and the hope that military service might offer an escape from the rigid segregation of his hometown of Birmingham, Alabama. He was 23 years old, educated, and had scored in the top 10% on his aptitude tests. His assignment to the Quartermaster Corps seemed promising initially. Williams kept a detailed diary throughout his service, entries that would later become part of the National Archives collection on the African-American experience in World War II. His entry from March 15th, 1944 described an incident at a small town in South Carolina. Williams and 5 other soldiers from his unit had been granted a weekend pass. Hungry after the long bus ride, they entered a restaurant on the main street. The owner, a heavy-set man with gray hair, looked up from the register and shook his head before they could even approach. "No colored served here," he said flatly. As the soldiers turned to leave, Williams noticed a group of German prisoners of war being escorted by 2 guards into the same establishment. The prisoners were seated immediately, menus placed in their hands by the same owner who had just refused service to American soldiers. Williams wrote that night that the scene had shaken something fundamental in his understanding of his place in the country he was defending. Here were men who had fought against American forces, who belonged to an army aligned with a regime built on theories of racial superiority and conquest, being welcomed where he was turned away. The prisoners wore uniforms marked with the letters P and W, designations that paradoxically granted them more social mobility in the American South than the uniform Williams wore with pride. The treatment of prisoners of war was governed by the Geneva Convention of 1929, which stipulated that captives should be housed and fed in conditions similar to those of the capturing nation's own troops. In practice, this meant that German prisoners in the United States often experienced better living conditions than they had known in wartime Europe. They received 3 meals daily, medical care, recreational facilities, and work opportunities that allowed them to earn small wages. The American military took its obligations under international law seriously, knowing that reciprocal treatment of American prisoners in enemy hands might depend on such compliance. What the architects of this policy failed to anticipate was how it would collide with the brutal realities of Jim Crow segregation in the South, where many of the prisoner of war camps were located. The same legal and social system that relegated black Americans to second-class citizenship made no such distinction for enemy combatants who happened to be white. The result was a series of contradictions that became increasingly impossible to ignore or justify. At Camp Como in Mississippi, Private Thomas Jefferson, a name he bore with particular irony, worked as a clerk in the camp administration office. His duties included processing supplies and coordinating work details for the German prisoners. Jefferson was from Chicago, where segregation existed but was less formalized and absolute than what he encountered in Mississippi. The culture shock was profound and disorienting. Jefferson's letters home to his wife, Dorothy, painted vivid pictures of daily indignities. He described watching prisoners board trains in regular passenger cars, while black soldiers were confined to segregated sections or freight cars. He wrote about camp stores where prisoners could purchase cigarettes, candy, and toiletries, while black soldiers were directed to separate facilities with limited stock. Most galling were the interactions in nearby towns, where prisoners on work details were welcomed in establishments that displayed signs explicitly barring colored patrons. The prisoners themselves often expressed confusion and discomfort with these arrangements. Unteroffizier Klaus Becker, a former schoolteacher from Bavaria captured in North Africa in 1943, kept his own diary of his captivity. After the conflict ended, Becker's writings were translated and published as part of an oral history project on the prisoner of war experience. In an entry from July 1944, Becker described being taken to a diner near Camp Shelby in Mississippi. The guard, a young white corporal from Tennessee, led Becker and 3 other prisoners inside without hesitation. As they were being seated, Becker noticed 2 black soldiers in uniform standing outside, looking through the window. When Becker asked the guard why those soldiers couldn't enter, the guard seemed surprised by the question, then explained matter-of-factly that colored folks had their own places. Becker wrote that he found this incomprehensible. He had been taught that Americans fought for freedom and democracy, concepts his own country's leadership had abandoned in favor of authoritarian control and aggressive expansion. Yet, here was a contradiction so stark that even an enemy prisoner could recognize its fundamental injustice. Becker noted that several of his fellow prisoners expressed similar confusion, particularly those who had been indoctrinated with propaganda about American racial conflicts but had dismissed such claims as exaggeration. Seeing the reality firsthand forced a re-evaluation. The psychological impact on black soldiers was profound and cumulative. Corporal James Mitchell, standing outside that Georgia diner, felt a complex mixture of emotions he later struggled to articulate in interviews decades after the conflict. There was anger, certainly, and humiliation. But there was also a clarifying determination. Mitchell and soldiers like him began to recognize that they were fighting 2 struggles simultaneously, one against fascism abroad and another against the system of oppression at home. This dual consciousness wasn't new to black Americans. W.E.B. Du Bois had written about it decades earlier, describing the experience of seeing oneself through the eyes of a hostile society while maintaining one's own sense of worth and humanity. But the war brought this tension into sharp, unavoidable focus. Every interaction became a reminder of the gap between American ideals and American practice. The Army itself was deeply segregated in 1944. Black soldiers served in separate units, usually under white officers, and were disproportionately assigned to service and support roles rather than combat positions. The logic was paternalistic and racist, based on unfounded beliefs about black soldiers' capabilities and reliability under pressure. When black units were allowed to engage directly, as with the Tuskegee Airmen or the tank crews of the 758th Tank Battalion, they performed with distinction, systematically disproving the prejudices that had limited their opportunities. But even exemplary performance couldn't shield black soldiers from the daily humiliations of segregation. Staff Sergeant Leonard Davis, a maintenance supervisor with the 93rd Engineer Battalion, kept meticulous records of what he called the indignity ledger, a personal accounting of discriminatory incidents. Over 18 months, Davis documented 73 separate occasions when he or soldiers under his supervision were refused service, denied access, or otherwise treated as inferior to enemy prisoners. His records included dates, locations, and names of witnesses. Davis later testified about these experiences before a military review board, though his testimony resulted in no immediate policy changes. The presence of prisoner of war camps throughout the South meant these confrontations were frequent and unavoidable. By mid-1944, approximately 375,000 enemy prisoners were held in camps across the United States, with the majority housed in the South and Southwest, where climate and available land made large facilities practical. The prisoners worked in agriculture, manufacturing, and infrastructure projects, often earning the appreciation of local communities for their productivity and generally cooperative behavior. This cooperation was strategic on the prisoners' part. Most German captives understood that their treatment in American hands was vastly superior to what they might expect elsewhere, certainly better than the conditions faced by American or British prisoners in enemy camps, and incomparably better than the fate of Soviet prisoners. The Geneva Convention guaranteed them certain rights, and American adherence to international law meant those rights were generally respected. Smart prisoners recognized that compliance and good behavior served their interests. What complicated this dynamic was the overlay of American racial hierarchies. White German prisoners could access spaces and services denied to black Americans, including those in uniform. This wasn't lost on the prisoners, many of whom came from a society with its own toxic theories about racial superiority. But even they could recognize the particular cruelty of men being denied dignity in their own country, while enemies were welcomed. Private Eugene Richardson of the Quartermaster Corps experienced this firsthand in a small town outside Fort Huachuca in Arizona during autumn of 1944. Richardson and two fellow soldiers had saved their pay for weeks to purchase supplies for a birthday celebration for their sergeant. The general store in town carried items unavailable at the base exchange. When they arrived, the owner informed them that colored customers had to wait until all white customers were served and use the back entrance. Richardson and his companions waited as directed. While they stood outside, a work detail of German prisoners arrived, escorted by a single guard. The prisoners entered through the front, were served immediately, and departed with their purchases while Richardson and the others remained waiting. The guard, a white private first class, seemed uncomfortable but didn't intervene. Richardson later said the guard avoided making eye contact, as if embarrassed by the situation, but unwilling or unable to challenge it. These experiences were documented, discussed, and shared among black soldiers, creating what historians would later recognize as a collective political awakening. Letters home carried these stories to black communities across the nation. The black press, including newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender, published accounts from soldiers describing the contradictions they faced. These reports fueled what became known as the Double V campaign, victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home, a framework that explicitly linked the struggle against enemy forces with the struggle for civil rights. The Double V campaign gave focus and language to what many black soldiers were experiencing. Launched by the Pittsburgh Courier in February 1942, the campaign resonated deeply with black communities and soldiers. It acknowledged the patriotism and commitment of black Americans to the defense of democracy, while demanding that democracy be extended to them fully. The treatment of enemy prisoners became a powerful symbol within this framework, evidence that American promises of equality remained unfulfilled. Military leadership faced increasing pressure to address these contradictions, though responses were often halting and inadequate. Some base commanders issued orders attempting to ensure that German prisoners didn't receive privileges unavailable to black soldiers, but enforcement was inconsistent and often undermined by local civilian authorities who controlled businesses and facilities off base. The military could regulate conduct on installations, but it couldn't force southern communities to abandon segregation. Lieutenant Colonel David Freeman, a white officer from Massachusetts who commanded a support battalion with both black and white units, attempted to implement equal treatment policies at his base in Louisiana during late 1944. Freeman ordered that prisoner work details would not be taken to any establishment that refused service to black soldiers. He also mandated integrated seating on base transportation and equal access to recreational facilities. Freeman's directives created immediate friction with local civilian contractors and business owners who threatened to refuse cooperation with the base. Within 3 weeks, Freeman was reassigned, and his policies were quietly reversed by his replacement. Freeman later wrote that the experience taught him that individual commanders, regardless of their personal convictions, couldn't overcome systemic discrimination without support from higher command and civilian government, support that simply didn't exist in 1944. The broader military leadership remained deeply ambivalent. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, recognized that segregation undermined military effectiveness and created morale problems, but he was unwilling to force desegregation while the conflict continued, fearing that such a dramatic change would create disruption and resistance that could harm the effort. Marshall's position was that social experiments shouldn't be conducted during wartime, a logic that frustrated black soldiers and civil rights advocates who argued that fighting for democracy abroad while accepting discrimination at home was itself the more dangerous contradiction. Meanwhile, interactions between black soldiers and German prisoners occasionally revealed unexpected complexities. Sergeant William Thompson worked as a translator at Camp Concordia in Kansas, one of the largest prisoner facilities in the United States. Thompson had studied foreign languages at Howard University before enlisting and was one of the few black soldiers with the linguistic skills needed for prisoner interrogation and administration. His position gave him regular contact with enemy captives, interactions that were often surprisingly cordial. Thompson's journal entries from this period describe conversations with German prisoners about their understanding of America and its racial dynamics. Many prisoners expressed genuine surprise at segregation, having assumed American propaganda about freedom and equality was largely accurate. Some prisoners, particularly those who had joined military service before the current regime's rise to power, were critical of their own government's racial theories and saw parallels between those theories and American Jim Crow laws. Others, more committed to their ideology, pointed to American segregation as evidence that racial hierarchies were natural and universal. One conversation Thompson recorded in detail occurred in November 1944 with a prisoner named Ernst Schaefer, a former journalist from Hamburg, captured in France. Schaefer asked Thompson directly how he could serve a country that treated him as inferior. Thompson's response, as he recorded it, was that he fought not for the America that existed, but for the America that could exist, and that black soldiers' service would provide undeniable evidence of their worth and patriotism, making continued discrimination harder to justify. Schaefer seemed to consider this, then said he hoped Thompson was right, but feared that prejudice was more resilient than Thompson believed. Time would prove both men partially correct. The war's progression brought these tensions to a head in multiple locations. At Camp Forest in Tennessee, during the winter of 1944 to 1945, a confrontation nearly escalated into violence when black soldiers from the Port Battalion stationed there were refused entry to a dance hall that had welcomed German prisoners the previous week. The soldiers, numbering approximately 40, gathered outside the hall demanding equal treatment. Military police were called, and the situation diffused only when a senior officer arrived and agreed to arrange a separate dance for the black soldiers, a compromise that satisfied no one but prevented immediate conflict. Similar incidents occurred throughout this period, each adding to a growing record of discrimination that would later inform policy changes. The Army's Judge Advocate General's Office compiled reports on racial incidents, documenting patterns that revealed the extent of the problem. These reports showed that morale among black soldiers was significantly lower than among white soldiers, with discriminatory treatment cited as a primary cause. Re-enlistment rates among black soldiers were notably lower, and disciplinary problems more frequent, correlating with experiences of discrimination. The contrast between prisoner treatment and black soldier treatment extended beyond restaurants and public facilities. Medical care, housing quality, recreational opportunities, and work assignments all reflected racial hierarchies that often placed enemy prisoners in better circumstances than loyal American servicemen. At some bases, prisoner-of-war compounds featured amenities like libraries, sports equipment, and even small orchestras, while black soldiers' quarters remained substandard and facilities limited. Corporal James Mitchell, whom we met outside that Georgia diner, eventually became a leader in organizing what he called consciousness meetings among black soldiers at Camp Gordon. These informal gatherings allowed soldiers to share experiences, discuss the contradictions they faced, and strategize about how to demand better treatment. Mitchell was careful to keep these meetings focused on legitimate grievances and proper channels for redress, aware that any hint of insubordination could result in severe punishment. But the meetings served an important purpose, creating solidarity and collective understanding among soldiers who might otherwise have felt isolated in their frustration. Mitchell's organizing came to the attention of the camp's intelligence officers, who monitored the meetings with concern that they might inspire resistance or undermine discipline. Reports from that monitoring, declassified decades later, reveal that officers recognized the legitimacy of soldiers' complaints, but felt powerless to address them within the existing military and civilian structure. One officer wrote in a confidential memorandum that the Army risked losing the loyalty of its black soldiers if conditions didn't improve, but that he saw no clear path to improvement given political realities in the South and the military's dependence on cooperation from local communities. The reality was that the Army existed within and depended upon the broader American society, with all its contradictions and failures. Military bases in the South required cooperation from local governments, businesses, and populations. Confronting segregation directly would have created conflicts that military leadership deemed too costly and disruptive. This calculation prioritized maintaining smooth operations over addressing injustice, a decision that black soldiers experienced as betrayal. Yet even as the military leadership avoided systematic change, individual actions began to accumulate. Some white officers, troubled by what they witnessed, used their authority to create small zones of equality within their commands. Captain Robert Jensen at Camp Swift in Texas established a policy that any facility serving prisoners must also serve all American soldiers regardless of race, effectively limiting where prisoners could go, but ensuring black soldiers weren't excluded. Jensen's policy was unofficial and limited to interactions he could directly control, but it represented an attempt by at least some leaders to align practice with principle. Prisoners themselves sometimes became unlikely witnesses to these contradictions in ways that complicated their own understanding. Obergefreiter Hans Weber, captured in Italy in 1944, worked on a farm labor detail in rural Mississippi during harvest season. Weber and his fellow prisoners were housed in a barn converted to temporary quarters, with meals provided by the farming family. The family treated the prisoners courteously, sharing meals with them at the family table. Black field workers employed by the same family ate separately and weren't permitted inside the family house. Weber, who had grown up in a small farming village in Bavaria, found this incomprehensible. He asked the farmer why employees couldn't share meals while prisoners could. The farmer explained patiently that prisoners were white, and that made all the difference. Weber later said this conversation was more disturbing than many experiences during active service, revealing a depth of prejudice that seemed irrational and cruel, even to someone from a society he now recognized had committed far greater evils. The cognitive dissonance experienced by prisoners who confronted American segregation while being treated relatively well themselves created complex reactions. Some prisoners used the observations to reinforce their existing prejudices, seeing American racism as validating their own beliefs about racial hierarchies. Others, particularly those already skeptical of their former government's ideology, recognized the hypocrisy and felt uncomfortable benefiting from it. A few prisoners formed unexpected friendships with black soldiers who worked at the camps, relationships that crossed enemy lines and racial barriers simultaneously. One such friendship developed between Private Robert Hayes, a supply clerk, and Feldwebel Otto Richter, a prisoner who worked in the same warehouse at Camp Hearn in Texas. Both men were in their early 30s. Both had worked in education before the conflict, and both found themselves far from home in confusing circumstances. They began conversations about literature and philosophy, discovering shared interests despite being on opposite sides of the global struggle. Richter asked Hayes about his experiences with segregation, and Hayes, perhaps because Richter was safely an enemy rather than a fellow American who might judge him, spoke candidly about the pain of being treated as inferior in his own country. Richter listened and admitted that he had believed propaganda about America being a land of freedom, and that seeing the reality had been disillusioning. The two men's conversations continued throughout Richter's captivity, a small example of human connection transcending the categories that divided them. The everyday realities of segregation manifested in countless small ways that accumulated into crushing weight. At Camp Ruston in Louisiana, Corporal Andrew Washington worked in the motor pool maintaining vehicles. His mechanical skills were exceptional, honed through years working in his father's garage before enlisting. Washington trained several German prisoners assigned to the motor pool, teaching them diagnostic techniques and repair procedures. The prisoners learned quickly and worked efficiently. Yet, when the base commander visited the facility, he praised the prisoners' work while barely acknowledging Washington's presence. When equipment broke down during off hours, Washington was called to make emergency repairs regardless of whether he was on duty. But during normal working hours, prisoners received the easier assignments while Washington handled the most difficult and dirty jobs. The message was clear. His expertise was valued only when convenient, and his dignity was never a consideration. These patterns extended to leisure time as well. Athletic facilities, movie theaters, and social clubs on bases were segregated, with black soldiers relegated to inferior options or denied access entirely. At Fort Hood in Texas, the base theater showed films twice weekly. German prisoners attended the main showing in the evening, occupying comfortable seats in the theater's main section. Black soldiers were assigned to a separate afternoon showing in the same theater, required to sit in a designated area, with older films and less comfortable seating. The prisoners watched current releases, while black soldiers saw films that were months or even years old. When black soldiers protested this arrangement, they were told that the schedule was established for operational efficiency and that changing it would create logistical complications. The real reason, unstated but understood by everyone, was that white civilian workers and contractors who used the theater refused to attend integrated showings. Transportation segregation created particular hardships. Soldiers traveling on leave faced the humiliation of Jim Crow laws throughout the South. Private Charles Bennett from New York traveled home on leave in December 1944. His journey required multiple train connections through southern states. At each transfer, Bennett had to navigate segregated waiting rooms, restaurants, and restrooms. The signs directing colored passengers to separate facilities marked his path with constant reminders of his inferior status. On one leg of the journey, Bennett boarded a train in Georgia and was directed to a car designated for black passengers. The car was older, more crowded, and located directly behind the locomotive, where smoke and noise made the journey particularly unpleasant. Bennett watched through the window as German prisoners boarded the same train, but were seated in regular passenger cars with white travelers. The prisoners had guards, but were otherwise treated as ordinary passengers. Bennett's uniform, which should have marked him as deserving respect and courtesy, instead seemed to highlight the contradiction between his service and his treatment. The disparity in medical care added another dimension to the inequality. Base hospitals were segregated, with black soldiers treated in separate wards that were typically less well-equipped and staffed than those serving white soldiers and prisoners. At Camp Livingston in Louisiana, Private First Class Samuel Edwards contracted pneumonia during winter training exercises. Edwards was hospitalized in the colored ward, a section of the base hospital that occupied an older building with inadequate heating. His treatment was competent, but the facilities were noticeably inferior to those in the main hospital building. During his recovery, Edwards learned that German prisoners who fell ill were treated in the main hospital alongside white American soldiers, receiving care in modern, well-heated wards with better equipment and more attentive nursing staff. The implication was unmistakable. Enemy status was less significant than racial category in determining the quality of care received. These accumulated experiences created what psychologists would later recognize as chronic stress and trauma. Black soldiers existed in a constant state of vigilance, never sure when the next humiliation would occur, always aware that their dignity could be casually dismissed regardless of their service or sacrifice. The psychological toll was significant, manifesting in various ways from quiet resignation to simmering anger to determined activism. Different soldiers responded differently, but all carried the burden of living with contradictions that challenged their sense of worth and belonging. The letters black soldiers sent home during this period reveal the emotional impact of these experiences. Private James Foster wrote to his mother in Philadelphia, describing an incident at a bus station in Alabama. Foster and 3 other soldiers were waiting for a bus to return to base after leave. When the bus arrived, the driver informed them they would have to wait for the next bus because the current one was full. Foster could see empty seats on the bus, but he also saw several German prisoners boarding with their guard. The driver explained that state law required segregated seating, and the colored section was full, even though the rest of the bus had available seats. Foster wrote that standing there in his uniform, having just completed training for deployment overseas, being told to wait so that enemy prisoners could ride, felt like being told his service and sacrifice meant nothing. His mother kept all his letters, and after his death in the 1970s, she donated them to a local historical society where they became part of an exhibit on the Black experience in World War II. The food service disparities particularly stung because sharing meals carries deep cultural significance related to equality and community. At Camp Shelby in Mississippi, the main mess hall served quality meals to white soldiers and prisoners, with varied menus and generous portions. Black soldiers ate in a separate facility that received less attention and resources. The food was adequate nutritionally, but limited in variety and often poorly prepared. Thanksgiving 1944 highlighted this disparity sharply. White soldiers and German prisoners shared a traditional Thanksgiving meal with turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, and multiple side dishes. The black soldiers' Thanksgiving meal was noticeably less elaborate, with smaller portions and fewer traditional items. Several black soldiers later recounted that day as particularly demoralizing, a holiday meant to celebrate American abundance and community, spent being reminded they were considered less deserving than enemy prisoners. The work assignments given to black soldiers versus prisoners also reflected discriminatory attitudes. Black soldiers were disproportionately assigned to labor battalions, quartermaster units, and other support roles that involved heavy physical work under difficult conditions. German prisoners, particularly those with technical skills or education, often received assignments that utilized their abilities and provided better working conditions. At Camp McCain in Mississippi, Corporal Henry Thompson worked in a labor battalion that built roads and infrastructure. The work was backbreaking, performed in extreme heat with inadequate breaks. Thompson noticed that German prisoners with engineering backgrounds were assigned to surveying and planning roles, working in shaded areas with frequent rest periods. When Thompson, who had studied engineering for 2 years before the conflict, requested assignment to technical work matching his training, he was told that labor battalions needed strong backs more than technical knowledge. The unstated reality was that black soldiers were viewed primarily as sources of manual labor, regardless of their actual capabilities. These patterns weren't limited to the South. Even in northern and western states where legal segregation didn't exist, informal discrimination created similar disparities. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, black soldiers experienced social segregation in nearby towns, where businesses and residents made clear, through various means, that they were unwelcome. German prisoners, by contrast, were often treated courteously by local populations who saw them as unfortunate soldiers who had ended up on the wrong side but were otherwise acceptable. The irony of enemy soldiers receiving warmer welcomes than American servicemen wasn't lost on the black soldiers who witnessed it. The military justice system also reflected racial bias. Black soldiers faced more frequent and harsher punishments for infractions compared to white soldiers or prisoners. Minor violations that might result in verbal warnings for white soldiers could lead to formal disciplinary action for black soldiers. At Fort Huachuca, statistics compiled by the base legal office showed that black soldiers received court-martialed proceedings at rates significantly higher than white soldiers for comparable offenses. German prisoners, despite being enemy combatants, faced disciplinary action less frequently than loyal American soldiers who happened to be black. This disparity in justice added to the sense that the system was fundamentally rigged against black servicemen. The cumulative weight of these experiences pushed many soldiers toward political consciousness and activism. Private First Class Raymond Cooper began his service in 1943 as apolitical, focused on completing his duty and returning home. By late 1944, After months of experiencing discrimination while watching prisoners receive better treatment, Cooper had become an avid reader of civil rights literature and an active participant in discussions about post-conflict social change. Cooper wrote in his journal that every incident of discrimination clarified his understanding of the struggle ahead and strengthened his resolve to work for change after his service ended. This transformation occurred across thousands of individual soldiers, creating a cohort of veterans who would return to civilian life with first-hand experience of American contradictions and determination to challenge them. The connections formed during service created networks that would later support civil rights organizing. Soldiers from different regions and backgrounds shared experiences and strategies, building solidarity that transcended geographical and cultural differences. These networks would prove crucial in the civil rights movement that emerged in subsequent decades. Some white soldiers also recognized the injustice and spoke out against it, though they were minority voices. Private Daniel O'Connor from Boston served in a support unit alongside both white and black soldiers. O'Connor wrote letters to his representatives in Congress describing the discriminatory treatment he witnessed and arguing that it undermined American moral authority and military effectiveness. O'Connor's letters received polite responses, acknowledging his concerns but promising no action. Still, soldiers like O'Connor demonstrated that opposition to segregation wasn't limited to those who suffered under it directly. The presence of prisoners from other nations added additional layers to these dynamics. Italian prisoners, captured in North Africa and Europe, were also held in American camps and generally received treatment similar to German prisoners. The complex web of racial categorizations and hierarchies in 1940s, America created a patchwork of inequalities that affected different groups in different ways, but the common thread was that race determined treatment more than citizenship, loyalty, or service. As 1945 began and the conflict in Europe entered its final phase, the prisoner of war population in the United States continued to grow. By May, when hostilities concluded in Europe, approximately 425,000 prisoners were held in American camps. The process of repatriation would take years, meaning these contradictions would continue well beyond the war's official conclusion. The experience of black soldiers during this period contributed to a transformation in consciousness that would fuel the civil rights movement in the following decades. Men who had served their country, witnessed its failures, and survived the experience returned home determined to demand the equality they had fought to defend. The GI Bill provided educational opportunities that created a new generation of black professionals, leaders, and activists. The networks and organizational skills developed during military service translated into civil rights organizing. The moral authority of veterans who had served in a global struggle against tyranny proved powerful in challenging domestic oppression. Corporal James Mitchell returned to Georgia after his discharge in late 1945. He used the GI Bill to attend college, becoming a teacher and later a principal. He remained active in his community, participating in voter registration drives and civil rights organizations. In interviews late in his life, Mitchell traced his activism directly to that moment outside the diner at Camp Gordon, watching enemy prisoners receive treatment denied to him. That experience, he said, clarified the nature of the struggle and the stakes involved. It made him realize that simply serving honorably wasn't enough. Change would require direct confrontation with injustice, sustained pressure, and unwavering commitment to the principles America claimed but failed to practice. Technical Sergeant Marcus Williams, whose diary entries captured so many of these experiences, also returned to civilian life determined to contribute to change. He became a journalist for a black newspaper, using his writing skills to document civil rights struggles and keep attention focused on inequality. His wartime diary was eventually donated to the National Archives, where it serves as primary source material for historians studying the black experience in World War II. Williams wrote until his passing in 1978, always maintaining that the contradictions of the war years had exposed truths that needed to be confronted rather than ignored. The German prisoners eventually returned to their homeland, carrying with them complicated memories of their captivity. Many prisoners later wrote or spoke about their experiences in America, often noting the contrast between their expectations and the reality they encountered. For some, seeing American segregation firsthand tempered their admiration for American democracy. For others, particularly those who remained in contact with American friends made during captivity, the experience of witnessing injustice while being treated well created lasting reflection about privilege, prejudice, and the gap between ideals and practice. Klaus Becker, the former school teacher whose diary recorded his confusion about segregation, returned to Bavaria and resumed teaching. He incorporated lessons about prejudice and the importance of examining one's own society's failings into his curriculum. In a letter to the Oral History Project that published his diary, Becker wrote that his time in America had taught him that even societies that claimed to represent freedom could harbor deep injustices, and that recognizing such contradictions was everyone's responsibility. He maintained correspondence with several Americans he had met during captivity, including one black soldier who had worked as a guard at his camp. Their letters, spanning decades, discussed the slow progress of civil rights in America and the parallel struggles of reconstructing society in post-conflict Europe. The systematic change that black soldiers hoped for didn't arrive quickly. The military wasn't fully integrated until 1948, when President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9802 mandating equality of treatment and opportunity in the armed forces. Even then, implementation was gradual and resisted in many quarters. Full integration took years to achieve and required continued pressure from civil rights organizations and advocates within the military itself. But the seeds planted during the war years germinated into movements that transformed American society. The soldiers who experienced the contradictions of fighting for freedom while being denied it at home became leaders, organizers, and witnesses whose testimony proved impossible to dismiss. Their service had earned them moral authority that they wielded effectively in demanding change. The specific absurdity of enemy prisoners receiving better treatment than loyal soldiers became a powerful rhetorical tool, an example so stark that even defenders of segregation struggled to justify it. In this sense, those moments outside diners, on segregated buses, and in countless other spaces where the contradictions were visible became catalysts. They were painful, humiliating experiences that could have crushed spirits and destroyed faith in American possibilities. Instead, they clarified the nature of the struggle and strengthened resolve. The soldiers who endured these experiences emerged not broken but determined, not disillusioned but clear-eyed about what needed to change and willing to continue working for that change. The broader impact extended beyond civil rights to influence American understanding of its own history and values. The contrast between the treatment of enemies and the treatment of black citizens forced a reckoning with uncomfortable truths about American democracy. It revealed that equality couldn't be assumed or taken for granted, but had to be actively defended and expanded. It demonstrated that legal structures and social customs that denied dignity to any Americans undermined the nation's claim to represent freedom and justice. Historians later recognized that the World War II era represented a turning point in the long struggle for civil rights, not because the conflict itself solved problems, but because it made contradictions undeniable. The participation of black soldiers in the defense of democracy, combined with the documented evidence of their treatment relative to enemy prisoners, created a record that couldn't be ignored or explained away. This record became evidence in legal challenges, material for journalists and activists, and testimony that moved public opinion toward recognizing the urgency of civil rights reform. The story of black soldiers and German prisoners also revealed something about human nature and social systems. It showed how arbitrary racial categories were, how they shifted based on context and served the interests of those in power. German prisoners were enemies by circumstance but allies by appearance, and that appearance granted them access and treatment denied to Americans whose loyalty was certain but whose skin color marked them for exclusion. This arbitrary nature of racial discrimination, made visible through the prisoner experience, helped expose segregation as a system built on prejudice rather than any rational principle. Some of the most powerful testimony came years after the conflict, as veterans reflected on their experiences and their meaning. In 1972, a documentary filmmaker interviewed dozens of Black World War II veterans about their service. Many spoke about the prisoner issue, and their accounts carried a consistency that testified to how widespread and impactful these experiences were. They remembered specific incidents with clarity decades later, suggesting how deeply the experiences had marked them. But they also spoke about how those experiences had motivated them, how seeing injustice so clearly had made them determined to address it. One veteran, whose name wasn't recorded in the documentary footage, but whose words were powerful, said that watching enemy soldiers eat while he stood outside hungry had been the moment he truly understood that the struggle for equality would be long and hard, but also absolutely necessary. He said it made him realize that America's promises were real, but unfulfilled, and that making them real would require more than military service. It would require political action, legal challenges, social movements, and the willingness of millions of Americans, black and white, to demand that the nation live up to its ideals. That moment outside a diner became for him a call to action that shaped the rest of his life. The transformation wasn't just individual, but collective. Black communities, receiving letters from soldiers describing these experiences, organized responses. Churches, civil rights organizations, and community groups used these accounts to build support for change. The Double V campaign gained strength from these specific documented examples of discrimination. The black press gave prominent coverage to the prisoner issue, running editorials and cartoons that highlighted the absurdity and injustice. This collective response helped transform individual experiences of humiliation into political momentum for reform. White Americans, too, were confronted with these contradictions, though responses varied widely. Some recognized the injustice and became allies in the struggle for civil rights. Others defended segregation more vigorously, seeing challenges to it as threats to their social order. Still others remained indifferent or conflicted, uncomfortable with discrimination, but unwilling to take action against it. The conflict didn't automatically change minds, but it provided evidence and arguments that civil rights advocates could use to challenge racism and build broader coalitions for change. The long-term impact can be traced through subsequent decades. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s drew leadership and participants from veterans who had served during World War II. Organizations like the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee included many veterans in their ranks. The discipline, organizational skills, and determination that military service had developed translated directly into civil rights organizing. The moral authority of veterans who had defended American freedom abroad while being denied it at home proved powerful in challenging segregation and discrimination. Legal challenges to segregation also benefited from the conflict's legacy. Cases like Brown versus Board of Education, which declared school segregation unconstitutional in 1954, were argued in part on the grounds that America couldn't claim to lead the free world while maintaining systems of racial oppression. The contrast between American ideals and American practice, made undeniable during the conflict, became a key argument for change. International pressure, particularly from newly independent nations in Africa and Asia, added weight to these arguments, as America's racial record became a liability in Cold War competition for global influence. The story of black soldiers and German prisoners thus became more than an interesting historical footnote. It represented a moment when contradictions became too obvious to ignore, when the gap between American rhetoric and American reality was exposed in ways that demanded response. The soldiers who lived through these experiences, who stood outside diners watching enemies eat, who endured daily humiliations while serving their country, became agents of change precisely because they refused to accept that such contradictions were acceptable or permanent. Their legacy is visible in the integrated military that exists today, where merit rather than race determines advancement and opportunity. It's visible in the civil rights legislation of the 1960s that dismantled legal segregation and expanded voting rights. It's visible in the ongoing struggles for equality and justice that continue to draw inspiration from those who came before and refuse to give up despite facing seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The transformation wasn't complete or perfect. Racism didn't end with integration, and inequality persists in various forms today. But the progress that has occurred traces back in part to those moments when contradictions were made visible, when soldiers refused to accept that serving their country should mean accepting second-class citizenship, when they turned humiliation into determination and pain into political action. In the end, what happened next after black soldiers watched German prisoners eat in diners they were banned from was a slow, difficult, essential transformation. Individual soldiers like James Mitchell, Marcus Williams, Robert Hayes, and thousands of others returned home and became activists, leaders, educators, and witnesses. They told their stories, organized their communities, challenged unjust laws, and refused to be silent about what they had experienced and what needed to change. They were joined by allies, white Americans who recognized that segregation was wrong and worked alongside black activists to demand reform. Together, they built movements that changed laws, shifted public opinion, and expanded the boundaries of American democracy. The German prisoners, for their part, returned home to a nation that had to confront its own far greater crimes and reconstruct its society from the ruins of authoritarian rule. Some carried with them memories of American contradictions that complicated simple narratives about democracy versus tyranny. Others focused on rebuilding their lives and moved forward without much reflection on their captivity experiences. But for those who thought seriously about what they had witnessed, the experience of seeing American segregation, while being treated relatively well, remained a reminder that prejudice took many forms and that no society was immune to its corrupting influence. The historical significance of this period lies not just in what happened, but in what it revealed and what it inspired. It showed that fighting for democracy abroad while denying it at home was unsustainable, both morally and practically. It demonstrated that those who experienced injustice directly could become powerful advocates for change. It proved that contradictions, when made visible and undeniable, could catalyze movements for reform. And it confirmed that progress, while never guaranteed, was possible when people refused to accept injustice as inevitable. The documentation of these experiences took many forms beyond personal diaries and letters. Official military reports, though often dry and bureaucratic in tone, captured statistical evidence of the disparities. Morale surveys conducted among troops revealed significantly lower satisfaction scores among black soldiers compared to their white counterparts, with treatment relative to prisoners frequently cited as a source of frustration and anger. Chaplains' reports noted increased counseling requests from black soldiers struggling with the psychological burden of serving a country that didn't value their service. Medical officers documented stress-related ailments that correlated with experiences of discrimination. This official record, combined with personal testimonies, created an archive that historians would later mine for understanding of this crucial period. The international dimension of these contradictions also deserves consideration. Allied nations, particularly those with colonial holdings in Africa and Asia, watched American racial dynamics with interest and sometimes criticism. The treatment of black American soldiers became a subject of discussion in British, French, and Soviet media, with varying degrees of accuracy and political motivation. Enemy propaganda, predictably, seized on American segregation as evidence of hypocrisy, though such claims rang hollow given the far worse atrocities committed by those regimes. Still, the international attention added another layer of pressure for reform, as American leaders recognized that racial discrimination undermined the nation's moral standing in the global struggle against totalitarianism and later in Cold War competition. Today, the story of black soldiers and German prisoners during World War II serves as a reminder of both how far America has come and how much work remains. It illustrates the long struggle for civil rights and the many people whose courage and determination made progress possible. It challenges comfortable narratives about American history and demands honest acknowledgement of past failures alongside celebration of eventual achievements. Most importantly, it honors the soldiers who served despite discrimination, who maintained their dignity in the face of humiliation, and who transformed their painful experiences into fuel for a movement that expanded freedom and equality for all Americans. Their service mattered not just because it contributed to victory in a global struggle, though it did. It mattered because it exposed contradictions that needed to be confronted, provided moral authority to challenge injustice, and created a generation of leaders who refused to accept that American democracy's promises were meant for some but not all. The moment James Mitchell stood outside that Georgia diner, watching enemy prisoners enjoy privileges denied to him, was painful and wrong, but it was also clarifying and ultimately transformative. It was a moment that helped change America, slowly and imperfectly but undeniably, toward becoming the nation it claimed to be. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.